continuing our study of the people of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Today we see faith on display among the judges of Israel. After Moses and Joshua led the Israelites to and into the promised land, God was their only real leader. When the people turned from him, he allowed their enemies to oppress them. When they cried out to God, he appointed judges to deliver them. Now, these judges were more like military leaders than what we normally think of as a judicial type judge. But we see this vicious cycle of apostasy, bondage, crying, and deliverance occurring over and over in the book of Judges. Now, Hebrews 11 highlights, there in verse 32, highlights four of the judges as examples of faith for us: Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah. Now, these men aren't perfect, as neither are the others who are mentioned in this hall of faith in Hebrews 11. The Hebrew writer simply commends their faith as worthy examples to us, and their remarkable valor and success in delivering their people from their foes and from the foes of God. See, they regarded themselves as called to this work by the Lord and as engaged in his service. And today we're going to focus on the first one that's listed, Gideon. Now, he's not the first judge, but he's the first one that Hebrews 11 mentions to us. And he's the one that is described as a mighty man of valor. Now, as we'll notice, that's kind of an interesting title for him, and we'll see where that title comes from and how well he really did it living up to it. But for this, we have to go back to the book of Judges itself, because Hebrews 11 only mentions the name of these judges. So let's go back now to Judges chapter 6. Here in Judges 6, we see the book begin with Israel in one of their vicious cycles. Verse 1 says, "Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian for 7 years." In verses 2 through 5, the Midianites destroyed the land of Israel. And we see the situation described in verse 6. "So Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord." So how did the Lord respond to their cry? He turned to Gideon. In verse 11 of chapter 6, we see where the angel of the Lord went to Gideon, who was threshing wheat while hiding from the Midianites. Yes, remember that. He's hiding from the Midianites. And so how does the Lord describe him or address him? Well, verse 12, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, 'The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor.'" And remember, this mighty man of valor is hiding from the Midianites. And God went on in verse 14, "Then the Lord turned to him and said, 'Go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you?'" Now Gideon, being now called as the fifth judge of Israel, was one who God clearly had faith in. But obviously at this point he did not feel like a mighty man of valor, nor demonstrate the faith in being one. In verse 13 we see his lack of faith in God. He said, "Oh my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles, which our fathers told us about, saying, 'Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt?' And now the Lord has forsaken us, and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites." And in verse 15, we see his lack of faith in himself as well, when he responded by God by saying, "Oh my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." Basically saying, God, you haven't demonstrated yourself, and I'm surely not able to do this. So much for being a mighty man of valor, a man of faith, a man who's committed to serving God. We don't see it yet in Gideon, do we? Well, let's continue. We see as we go on in chapter 6, still God states his assurance to Gideon. In verse 16, he says, "Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites as one man." So how does Gideon respond? Basically by saying, "Prove it, God." In verse 17, faithless Gideon wants proof. "If now I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who talk with me." Well, in the following verses 18 through 21, that's exactly what God did. God showed him a sign. We see after that, the Lord gives Gideon his first real direct command. Beginning verse 25 says, when now it came to pass that same night that the Lord said to him, take your father's young bull, the second bull of 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the wooden image that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on top of this rock in the proper arrangement, and take the second bull, and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the image which you shall cut down. So what is this mighty man of valor going to do? Well, we see in the next verse, Gideon took 10 men from among his servants and did as the Lord had said to him. But because he feared his father's household and the men of the city too much to do it by day, he did it by night. So we commend Gideon for mustering the faith to obey God, but yet we see fear kept him from doing it openly. Now, this is the first time Gideon's fear is specifically mentioned, but we will see it again. And as we continue here in chapter 6, verses 36 through 38, Gideon again doubted God and asked for another sign, which God provided. And then in verses 39 and 40, he asked for yet another sign. And again, God patiently provided it. So then we come on to chapter 7. Chapter 7 begins with Gideon gathering the people together. He gathered the people together to fight the Midianites, seemingly gaining faith. But God told him he had too many people. Verse 3, now therefore proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead. And 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. God cut his army from 32,000 to 10,000. Now I wonder if Gideon was tempted to join them when he saw how many left. But in spite of this, God wasn't through. In verses 4 through 8, God said the people are still too many. And he took Gideon's 10,000 and cut them all the way down to 300. Now, would this reduction in your army possibly shake your faith? I mean, Gideon's faith seemed to be building to some degree. He did call the people together. What's this going to do to his faith when his army is slashed down to 300 men? Well, it appeared to shake Gideon's faith and again return fear. As we continue, we see in verse 9, God told him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have delivered it into your hand. But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah, your servant, and you shall hear what they say. And afterward your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. God knew the heart of Gideon. He could see the fear coming in as his army was reduced. And so he sends him down to be strengthened. Well, Gideon obviously feared, because we see in verse 11 through 15, he did go. And also, we see that what he heard strengthened his faith. In verse 15, when he returned to the camp of Israel, he said, arise, for the Lord has delivered the camp of Midian into your hand. Here we see his fear has turned to faith. Now, that was in spite of the fact that the enemy was described a few verses earlier as being as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as the sand by the seashore in multitude. So Gideon, in spite of the great number of the enemy, finally had enough faith in God to take 300 men to battle them. Now, when you have faith, how do you equip an army of 300 for battle against such a large enemy force? Well, Gideon did what anybody would probably do. Verse 16, he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put a trumpet into every man's hand with empty pitchers and torches inside the pitchers. Now, there's exactly how you want to equip 300 men to go out and fight an innumerable number with a pitcher, a trumpet, and a torch. Not your typical battle fare. And notice what he went on to say in verse 17. This man who once had no faith in God or himself said, "Look at me and do likewise." He now had the faith that God would be with him and that God would lead him in leading others. And notice what he said, what he told the people to do, or what they did in verse 20. Then the three companies blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers. They held the torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands for blowing. And they cried, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." Now when they acted in faith, God did his part as well. In verse 22, when the 300 blew the trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his companion throughout the whole camp. Basically, God took the Midianites and turned them against each other. They were so confused by what Gideon and his man did with the trumpets and the torches that they began to kill each other. And Gideon's victory against Midian was so great that years later the prophet Isaiah referred to it in Isaiah 9 and chapter 10 as the day and slaughter of Midian. Such a great day of victory for God and his people. So we think about this great victory of Gideon. He went from fearing to now having faith, now achieving victory. What's next for him? Well, as we come to chapter 8, we see that the victory did not go to Gideon's head. In verse 22, we see then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, both you and your son, and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian." Notice the people of Israel didn't seem to fully realize where the credit really went. And Gideon could have let this attention and recognition go to his head and considered a way to build up his family. But Gideon's faith wasn't just in himself. His faith in himself was because of his faith in God. And so Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." You see, Gideon went from doubting God's presence to having faith in his rule. And we see as a result in verse 28, "Thus Midian was subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lifted their heads no more. And the country was quiet for 40 years in the days of Gideon." Yes, in the days of Gideon, that mighty man of valor. Not always a man of valor, at some point doubting himself and doubting God. But through what God was able to prove to him, he became the great man of valor that God knew all along he could be. So, if you go through a difficult time in your life and doubt God's presence, know that he has ways of proving himself to you and strengthening your faith in him. Even when you may not feel like a mighty man of valor, have the faith that God can make you into one.